Salutations, respected viewers. I am George from Ireland. This video is about the logical fallacies of Ben Shapiro. Now, you may know Ben Shapiro. He's one of America's foremost conservative commentators, and he lives in California, which is a place he ought to think is the den of iniquity. He grew up there too. He's thought to be a debating wizard, and he has this coveted ability to convince people. But I'm going to dissect some of his strategies a bit later. So Mr. Shapiro has clearly picked his constituency, which would consist of gun nuts, Zionists, Christian evangelicals, free market fundamentalists, general conservatives. Now, these groups, they all overlap. And like anything else, know your audience. And he does. So he tells them what they want to hear. Now, not everything he says is dribble. I sometimes agree with him. So the sort of people who are his target audience, they're not known for their cognition. Their critical faculties are often suspended. I mean, think of religious people for a start. And he's one of them. I know he's not Christian. So his enemies are often bad. So this is where I concur with what he says sometimes. He pours scorn on many liberal left pieties, and for that I thank him. But I don't warm to him, I must confess. He's often sneering. He comes across as stuck-up, mean-spirited. He delights in belittling people. I think, what does that say about him? And he seems to want to do nothing about suffering and privation in his own country and abroad. So he comes across as thoroughly dislikable, but he could still be dead right. Because what I've said up until now, that could all be seen as ad personam. You're going for the individual rather than the argument, because you can't demolish the argument, so you're just trying to be spiteful towards that person in order to say, well, if this person is loathsome, his argument must be fallacious. But no, that doesn't hold true. He could be the most dislikable person in the world, and I don't go that far, he's not, but his argument could still be logically sound. So, he amasses evidence and employs it effectually to persuade people, and he strives to construct a cogent and logical argument. Sometimes he does. So he was born in California, I think. Well, said he grew up there, but he ought to dislike it, and he's often railing against the immorality of Hollywood because it's all about vice, drugs, what goes else on there, nude dancing. Gays, he's not too keen on them. Immigration, well, he's not against immigration in principle. Obviously, he's against illegal immigration and to have no mercy for these people. He's often talking about how black people behave so badly, and Hispanic people likewise, how children being born out of wedlock is a disgrace. He's very anti-abortion. He's inveterately opposed to the minimum wage, and he's not too keen on wind turbines, things like that. Skeptical about climate change. He doesn't want to see gun control. He detests sanctuary cities. He doesn't want higher taxation. I remember when they had a Republican governor there, not that long ago, Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was one of the most liberal people in the Republican Party. And anyway, but why live there if it's so detestable? I mean, the weather can't compensate that much for this utterly disgusting lack of moral standards. So, name Shapiro, it's a well-known Ashkenazi name. One of the few other Shapiros I knew, was Mao Zedong's translator. I remember when I was in China reading some of his editions of Chinese tales in English. But this Mr. Shapiro, Ben, knows an awful lot about communist tyranny, often uses that one. So one of his favourite strategies is the fallacy of many questions. He machine guns his opponent with many complicated questions rather than defend his position or explicate his model. In debating, is like saying, so this is what we want to do and this is how it's going to work. A bit like one of my videos saying, imagine we required all children to do a PE lesson every day at school, not just twice a week. And I explain, this is how it worked, this is what it would happen, and this is how we'd prove that people have done their sports, and we would have exemptions for those who are physically disabled. That's the model. Anyway, I remember he counterattacked with a series of why not questions, or explain to me why so many African American children are born out of wedlock. Explain to me why African Americans have a lower income than whites. Explain to me why More of them are in prison than whites, and blah, blah, blah. So that's just too many questions, and your opponent just doesn't have time to go through those one by one. He or she has got something else to say that's the gravamen of his or her case. But because the questions are left unanswered, it may appear to the audience as though Shapiro has launched a very effective attack. So the lack of a reply appears to vindicate the questioner, even though some of the questions are not strictly germane, and the answers are highly complex. A proper answer would be very lengthy, and there simply isn't time in a debate to do that. So you have to come to the point. So there's a logical fallacy, and logical fallacies are arguments which dupe many but are in fact unsound. Now, there are perhaps 100 logical fallacies. Some of them have several different names, often known by the Latin name as well. So Mr. Shapiro is a very experienced and seasoned debater, and he knows how to use these. And unless people are very experienced themselves and know a great deal about debating, these ones may easily slip under the radar and they may be duped by them. So anyway, I think I'm just going to concentrate on one debate in particular. This was November 2016. I'll post a link to this at the bottom. This was on 770 KTTH, a conservative radio station, but it was filmed as well. So it's almost as though he tried to pack in as many logical fallacies as he could to not quite 10 minutes. And this is not in order, unfortunately. So one of the things he did was to use the thought-terminating cliche. That's a logical fallacy, socialism. There are buzzwords and they're trigger words for his audience. As soon as he says socialism, a lot of his audience will think, oh my goodness, that's dreadful. Okay, it's a bit like calling someone Nazi or racist or whatever. Now, Nazis and racists, they exist, that's true. Socialists are very seldom as bad as Nazis. And I know who'd say, oh, Nazis are a kind of socialist, which there's a grain of truth in that, but that would be a tangent to this video. So Mr. Shapiro has his clack, and they will jeer or clap or hoot on cue. And socialism or socialist is a word that he knows will evoke a response, a bit like President Trump does this. There was a certain Central European statesman who said, the crowd have no critical faculty, and that's the case here, because the atmosphere can be electrified. People are buzzing with adrenaline. So this is framing, associating something with something else, guilt by association. If I can say this is socialist, then it's dreadful. A bit like, saying that Medicare or Medicaid is socialist, so we must get rid of it. But does it actually help people? Does it actually harm people? Avoiding the more pertinent questions. So at the outset of the speech, Mr. Shapiro said, I went to Harvard, right? Harvard Law School. This is appeal to accomplishment. Because I've accomplished a lot, I must be correct. Now, he is a brainy chap, but that doesn't mean that we have to agree with him. And there are plenty of other very cerebral types who disagree with him, particularly there, I would submit. It comes across as a bit of a braggart. It's a bit like the argument from authority. Okay, I hold whatever position, or I've got these letters behind my name, therefore I am correct, a logical fallacy. Sometimes it can be true. If it's me arguing against a climate scientist, I think I know who's more likely to be right, since I know precious little about climate science. But this is not really a matter of knowledge of minimum wage economics. He doesn't claim to be an economist. Neither am I. So now, admittedly, he was saying this because he said, I earn lots of money because I have these qualifications. And, of course, there's truth to that. That is a more limited truth than you might suppose. I'll come on to that later. So it was also the appeal to wealth. I'm handsomely paid, therefore I must be correct. And yes, he is very well remunerated. So Mr. Shapiro said that if you have better qualifications, you get paid more. Now, often that's true, but there are multiple exceptions to that. It's been shown that the more qualifications you have, the more money you make, up to and including a master's degree. Once you get a PhD, you actually earn a bit less than people with master's degrees, I suppose partly because you go into areas of work which are not quite so handsomely remunerated, such as being an academic. There are people with no qualifications at all who make lots of money. They could be sports stars, they could be singers, they could be gamblers, they could just strike it lucky. They could just play the stock market, which can be gambling sometimes. They could be drug dealers, legal or illegal. You can still make lots of money. If money is some sort of barometer of morality or educational achievement, well, I think that's dead wrong. You could be a prostitute, you could be a porn star, and I know that he very much disapproves of them, but hey, give the people what they want. You can't buck the market. So it's not always about qualifications. So Mr. Shapiro asked, is it the role of government to implement cosmic justice? I suppose we're getting back to this fallacy of many questions. He's obviously implying, no, it's not, that the government should not be imposing justice. Well, what are governments for? It's to help people to sort out problems, to do right. Well, I remind him of the Pledge of Allegiance, and I know he's a big fan of children being required to say this on a daily basis, ending with liberty and justice for all. Justice. So that's why we have states and a federal government. So there are courts and there are legislatures to make and unmake laws and so on for the purpose of justice, to sort out problems. Now, I realize it can go too far and they could intervene a bit too much in people's lives. So he said, well, he's 5'9", he's never going to be a basketball player, brought up the fact he's Jewish. Well, that's really got nothing to do with playing basketball or not. And saying he's sad that he can't be like Kobe Bryant, so the government can't make him a basketball player. He was being flippant. It was the appeal to ridicule. He's likening the minimum wage to saying that he should be made an NBA star. And nobody's suggesting that. That's a sort of straw man argument. Then there's the appeal to nature, another logical fallacy, claiming that the minimum wage is unnatural, though he didn't actually use the word unnatural. But he said this is how economies work. Well, economies are man-made. We can make them a different way. And they are not something which is like a biological or chemical or physical process. We have rules about what we permit and what we forbid. In terms of products, we have also regulations, who's allowed to buy it, at what age, what we're willing to sell abroad, and what taxes we have on things coming in or going out or staying within your country. There are governmental subsidies to lots of businesses. Governments intervene all the time. So we permit products we didn't used to allow. Things like that, you can only buy certain amounts of various products. So, no, it's not natural. We can fashion the market in a different way. There's also the appeal to tradition, another logical fallacy. Well, we didn't have a minimum wage in the past, so we shouldn't have it now. There's this sort of federal minimum wage, but then, the states don't have to go with that. Some of them have none, some of them have a higher one, some of them have a lower one. And then there was the broken window fallacy. So there will be costs to introducing the minimum wage, but that could be worth it for the gain in other areas. Okay, he's not thinking of the lost opportunity costs. So, but if we have a minimum wage, yes, a business will have to pay slightly more, but people will have more money to put into the economy and things like that. Is the differential propensity to spend. So a billionaire only needs to spend a fraction of his wealth to have a magnificent lifestyle, but someone on minimum wage has to spend every cent of that just to get by. So that's putting more into the economy, more necessaries being purchased, not more luxuries are being purchased. So it's not so obvious what is being lost by not introducing this. So there are many who want to argue the minimum wage is good for the economy. There have been numerous studies on this. I shan't plunge into the statistics. The evidence is somewhat mixed. What level do you set it at? I accept it can be too high. He doesn't accept that a wage can be too low, that there should be no minimum. I don't think there should be a maximum. But anyway, I don't think it really is going to impoverish people. It seems to be really the height of illogic to claim that paying people more would make them poorer somehow. We can come on to what it does to unemployment. And the difficulty in figuring out this general impact is there's so many extraneous factors. Look at all the other variables about the trade you're doing with other countries, or the economic cycle, or the retirement age, or the school leaving age. Anyway, back to the topic. Another logical fallacy of his was circular reasoning. So he says that the market determines wages, but that's your conclusion. The market determines wages. So your premise and your conclusion are the same. So we haven't gone from one thing to proving another. Now, we have different abilities, that's true. So we are not all going to earn the same wage. I don't know of any country ever which had the same wage for everybody. North Korea or the Soviet Union, even in its most communistic phase, didn't do that. He starts out with what he wishes to end up with, that yes, that the markets decide what the wage should be. But we don't have to be free market absolutists. There are many market economies, in fact most of them, which do have a minimum wage. Anyway, there's another logical fallacy of his, ignoratio elenchi, which is the irrelevant conclusion. Markets decide the wage, right? But that's not pertinent. Should we have a minimum wage to give people a decent standard of living? He doesn't engage with that one. Someone has to be the lowest paid in society. Some people are talentless, frankly. You know, I see people wearing sandwich boards. Now, anybody can do that. You could have no qualifications at all. You could be very old. You could be very young, and you just have to stand there. That's it. And so that's about the lowest skilled job there is, and so they're going to be paid abysmally. They're 10 a penny. They could be replaced like that. But should we be happy with a situation where they have an utterly miserable standard of living, whether they're paid so little that they're malnourished, they can never afford to replace their clothes when they're worn through and it's freezing cold outside? I suggest that in a civilized society, we should try to palliate their suffering. Now, there's the straw man argument, another logical fallacy. This one is very well known. He said the government should not try to create a level playing field. Now, the government isn't trying to introduce one, and I don't know anybody who suggested one, a completely level playing field with equal wages for all, with giving people jobs that they are not capable of doing because they lack the ability to do them. This is what Mr. Shapiro said. I would never force an employee to work for a certain wage because it violates the 13th Amendment. That would be slavery. Nobody has suggested forcing a worker to take a job, any job, or forcing them to, accept a certain wage. And by the way, he doesn't object to compulsory military service in his beloved Israel. Is that slavery? It's making people do things that they don't want to do. So no one's talking about forcing a worker to work for a certain employee. He dupes people. And one of his colleagues in this debate said, well, if there was a $15 minimum wage and you were willing to work for $2.50 an hour, that would be a crime. Well, we don't have to prosecute the worker. You could prosecute the employer for wage slavery. So he hoodwinks people. Anyway, Mr. Shapiro goes on to say he wouldn't force an employer to pay a certain wage. Well, we force them to do other things, like in certain circumstances to make health insurance contributions, which I don't think he's opposed to. But anyway, there's false equivalence. He likens minimum wage to slavery. We should be outraged by that. Slavery is the cruelest thing that somebody can do. And he thinks paying people decently is tantamount to slavery. It just beggars belief. It's nauseating. Anyway, he's a very moralistic chap, but exploitation's absolutely fine by him. Does exploitation exist at all in an economic sense? I know he'd concur that, say, sexual exploitation can exist, or he doesn't want children to work full-time because they can't meaningfully consent to contracts. But how about economic exploitation? Could that exist? I think it could. Another logical fallacy of his, appeal to consequences. The minimum wage would improve the standard of living. That's what his advocates claim. But he says he can't contest that, so he says it will increase joblessness. Now, we don't know that consequence would come to pass, and there are many examples where it didn't. Say the United Kingdom introducing it in about 2000, and unemployment went down. Now, I know it subsequently went up. I don't know anyone who claims that's because of the minimum wage. It's gone down again to its lowest ever level. Anyway, there are numerous examples around the world where minimum wage hasn't led to a spike in unemployment. But, it's difficult to go from the particular to the general. This situation couldn't necessarily be replicated in the United States. So I'm avoiding a logical fallacy there myself. He used appeal to consequences again. If you had a minimum wage, it will raise rent and so on. That's unproven. He didn't cite an example where that actually happened. And even if it did, that didn't prove it would happen again in this other instance. They're talking about Washington State in particular. So his claim was unfalsifiable. We can't prove that it won't happen. We can say how unlikely it is to happen. And he says, well, the rents will rise. We'll have to build more affordable housing. Well, you could not build affordable housing because I'm sure he's against that, market intervention. And to pay for this affordable housing, you have to raise taxes and prices will go up and real wages will go down. Well, so it's not working. And by the way, real wages have been going down for decades for American blue collars. He didn't cite an actual example of where this has happened. I thought he might try Detroit, but he didn't come up with that. And then Detroit's problems are broader than that, to do with the decline of the auto industry and things. Anyway, so another logical fallacy of his was the slippery slope fallacy. On wages, why not go all the way up to $100 an hour? Why don't you stop there, Ben? Why don't you go say $1 billion an hour? Has the man no sense of proportion, reasonableness? So we know unreasonableness when we see it. It's difficult to define reasonableness. So he said there's low teenage employment in Washington state, but he didn't demonstrate a causal link, say that that was because of the minimum wage. He didn't prove that that was due to the minimum wage. There could be many other reasons why adolescents in that state don't work as much as adolescents in other states. They might be working in the black economy, so it's never recorded. And he did say that that would be one of the repercussions of introducing minimum wage. But wouldn't he like that then? Because they'd be working for below the minimum wage? So it's not really doing any harm, according to his rationale. So teenagers in this state might not work very much because their parents are better off and they don't need to work because they're getting a decent wage. It could be that these adolescents are studying more or have more time for their hobbies, have more time for shooting guns, which you would like, have more time for Bible study, which you would heartily approve of. So we don't know that it's caused by the minimum wage. Even if it is, to some extent, it might be a very minor factor, one amongst several. So that's another fallacy, the fallacy of a single cause. There could be multiple causes, and we have to determine the relative importance of several different factors. Now, another logical fallacy he used there was the appeal to ridicule, the notion of $100 minimum wage. And to some extent it's a straw man, because I don't know anyone who's ever advocated $100 minimum wage. So he's just trying to get people laughing and claim that the opponent's policy is completely risible. So I'm going to Shapiro, Mr. Shapiro. If low wages are so wonderful, why don't you pay 1 cent a century? Can you imagine the economic growth? Wouldn't that be fantastic? Because the profits for these corporations would be so huge. That would just be brilliant for the economy, you know? And then loads of people would starve to death, so we wouldn't have to worry about pensions, and we wouldn't have to worry about schooling people so much, and we wouldn't have to worry about crime because the poor had died of starvation. Brilliant. Now, that was obviously a completely facetious and preposterous argument, but that's the kind of thing he's doing just on the other side. Now, he then claimed he wanted to see leftist policies implemented because then everyone would perceive how catastrophic they were. But that is a self-contradiction fallacy. He also said that he doesn't want to see them implemented, so make your mind up. Anyway, so his opponents were very moderate and said, why don't we phase it in, the minimum wage, instead of introducing it all at once? But Mr. Shapiro is then saying, but if they have such big profits, why don't you just make these corporations dip into their piggy bank and pay it all at once? So he was trying to make his opponents more hardline than it actually is, which to some extent is the appeal to ridicule and is a straw man. So he's always suggesting that his opponents should follow their line of reasoning right to its logical vanishing point. No, you don't have to go all the way. You can be somewhere in the middle. It can be more restrained. This is an absolutist fallacy, the notion that, as I say, you have to carry something to the nth degree. Not true. So, like, even he accepts some restrictions on firearms. It's not, and I know that that could be logical. You don't have to say that, every baby should be allowed an assault rifle in kindergarten. So the economy is not a fixed pie that it can grow. This is one of the things Mr. Shapiro was saying. We are not hunter-gatherers. We're not about to kill each other with rocks. That was his appeal to ridicule. Of course, nobody is suggesting that. So come on, he's bereft of serious arguments. Yet another logical fallacy of his was the contradiction in terms. He talked about forced altruism. That's what capitalism is, according to him. If I do not give you something that I want, I will starve. Well, altruism is not forced. Altruism is doing something, expecting nothing in return. What he said was the perfect inversion of capitalism. I'm doing it because then there's something good for me. All right? It's not an act of charity. It would be voluntary self-abnegation. And he is advocating the very opposite. Then there was another logical fallacy, the appeal to spite. Socialism is the most selfish creed on earth, he said. That I should get something simply for breathing. Now, if you are a freeloader not contributing to your society, yeah, it can be selfish. But if you're someone who accepts a lower standard of living because he or she is willing to share with others to help the needy, people sometimes are physically disabled or very elderly or children who for some reason cannot fully provide for themselves, then that would be unselfish. He must hate Israel with its socialist founders and with its kibbutzim, which are socialist communes. Now, cherry picking, another logical fallacy of his. He disregards evidence which blows his argument out of the water. He says that a minimum wage would have a deleterious effect on employment. And as I cited, there are numerous examples where that did not take place. There are minimum wages in many, many prosperous places, such as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Italy. I could go on all day. There's some minimum wage in countries which are not as prosperous, like say Romania. But that's not to say it's less prosperous because of this. As he would point out, well, it's emerging from communism still, which meant it isn't so rich. And there are other factors. It doesn't have much by the way of mineral resources. And there's been so much of a brain drain. People have gone away in search of a higher minimum wage. Monaco, one of the richest countries in the world per capita, and they've got a minimum wage. I could go on and on all day. Really just about every highly advanced economy in the world has it. Canada, and there's some countries which are not so wealthy which also have it. But you know, he's contending that minimum wage will always be catastrophic, will always lead to mass unemployment, whereas in fact that's not the case. Now, another logical fallacy of his was magical thinking. He says if the government were to abolish food stamps, wages will automatically increase. That's a direct quotation, automatically increase. We don't know that it's like waving a magic wand and they will instantly jump. The belief that believing it will make it happen appears to be there. If you just believe hard enough that we can be sure this will happen. I've not heard of anyone else who claims that it would definitely happen. And if it did happen, there was a time lag. What would you do in that time lag? Depends how long it was. A month, a year, 10 years? And how much would they increase by? 1 cent an hour? It would have to be enough to compensate for having the food stamps taken away. So he likened government food stamps to subsidies for companies and said that the food stamps were not paid to the employees of small businesses. Well, the solution then would be to give food stamps to all low-paid people, even if they work for a small business or are self-employed. I don't know of any example in the world of this automatic increase. He certainly didn't cite one. And if it doesn't work, what's going to happen? Starvation? Well, that would solve poverty, I suppose, by starving the penurious to death. Anyway, so that was another logical fallacy of his, wishful thinking. Another logical fallacy of Mr. Shapiro's is the argument from ignorance, claiming something is true because it cannot be falsified. Well, I mean, I can't prove that this wouldn't happen, but that doesn't mean that we should accept that it would. Then there was another logical fallacy, the argument from repetition, that claiming that minimum wages eliminate jobs. And I've been hearing this since the early 90s, since I first started to engage with such issues. It has been repeated ad infinitum by ultra-capitalist advocates, so it must be true, many people think, even though there are many examples where it didn't happen. Now, I'm not saying that there are no examples whatsoever where this occurred, but I'm not aware of any. Draws under my attention. I don't say it's impossible. There was another logical fallacy of his, a red herring. He said Bill Gates did so much good with his inventions. All right, but not really relevant to the minimum wage debate. I believe Mr. Gates is in favour of the minimum wage, so not a good example to cite from his perspective. He said that Mr. Gates did more good for the world than Mother Teresa. Well, Bill Gates had rather more money to do good with, and Mother Teresa didn't have that much money despite donations from the savings and loans fraudster. And this is another logical fallacy, the overwhelming exception. Yes, Bill Gates was for some time the richest man on the planet. So he's hardly a representative example of what's going to be good about setting up a business. If my hot dog stall, if I has one, is my business, I don't think I'll be able to do quite so much good for the world as Bill Gates. And what's he doing? What are the things? Isn't he trying to provide antiretrovirals to people who are suffering from HIV? The very kind of thing that I'm sure Mr. Shapiro would disapprove of, because, of course, these people deserve it due to their sexually immoral lifestyle. Or handing out contraceptives. Surely Mr. Shapiro would say, no, abstinence, only sex education. So another logical fallacy of his was survivorship bias. Okay, we know about Bill Gates because his company thrived so much. There are numberless businesses that have failed that we are not going to remember because they didn't survive. So yeah, goods and services, they generate money, they raise our quality of life. Not much good if you can't afford those goods and services. You know, the minimum wage, you can afford the necessities of life, and that's about it. So, Mr. Shapiro does not want his fellow Americans to be able to afford many of these things. Now, why are people rich? Yes, it can be because they provide splendid goods and services, but quite often they inherit their wealth. Look at the Trump family. Now, they could be getting rich of harmful things like drugs, legal or illegal, like guns, I mean, guns don't harm people, do they? I mean, anyone who says that really has got no credibility. They could be getting rich through alcohol, tobacco, or things which cause great deals of pollution. I'm not opposed to all the things I just mentioned, incidentally, but don't claim it's always by providing things which are useful, which improve the quality of life. As I say, you could have got rich through gambling, simply through owning land. You might have got that land for free from the US government in the 19th century when they took it off the Native Americans and just been lucky enough to find oil under it or something like that. So there are all sorts of ways in which you haven't done anything to be very wealthy. So there was that differential propensity to spend, which I mentioned earlier. So he says, what does it matter if the minimum wage is $14 or $15 an hour? It won't make the economy grow. But he said you need millions in investment to create a good product or service. Well, you know, de minimis incipe. You could start with a tiny thing, like I said, like a hot dog stall, and turn it into a multi-billion dollar empire. That's the American dream, is it not? Even the small man can strike it rich. $14 to $15 an hour, no difference. All these $1 add up, and they make a very big difference to those who are living on the breadline, you know, who are teetering on the edge of absolute destitution. And it's often minerals make the economy grow. As I said, it's not just products and services, just being lucky enough to find it. Prospecting. Now, I know there's some, what do they call it, geophysics involved. I know there are seismic tests, but you can just be lucky in inheriting land with minerals under the soil. There was another logical fallacy, the fallacy of a single cause. Economic growth is due to inequality, he submits. So it's nothing to do with education. That helps people a lot. Having good education, as he said, has helped him a lot, and his parents having money and sending to a private school. Laws, if you know the law of contract and so on, and a sound legal system, we all know that's far better for the investment climate. Just being lucky, having loads of minerals. Republic of Ireland, we've got almost none, so that held our economy back till very recently. Quality of land, as in, you know, the soil being fertile, how much land you have, geographical position, or having a coastline. There are dozens of other factors. It's not just that. So there's another logical fallacy, the wrong direction. The mistakes are called, he mistakes cause for consequence. All right, he says inequality causes economic growth, but economic growth also causes inequality, and indeed widens the inequality gap, because the rich are gaining wealth at a much faster rate than the poor are gaining wealth, and indeed they could be going opposite directions. The rich could be actually enriching themselves, while the poor could be sinking deeper into poverty, and that's what's been happening in the United States in relative terms since the 70s. So he says that a minimum wage favours large businesses. So why do large businesses sometimes oppose minimum wages? If it was good for them, they'd always want it. If the mighty dollar is the only thing they care about, if you're just going to worship mammon, you would say, nah, no minimum wage, and have a cartel. All the corporations agree to keep wages as low as possible. And odd that they've been doing that, as CEO pay has been going up again and again. So wealth inequality can cause economic growth, so he says. And I'm not saying it's always true, and I accept actually quite a wide degree of inequality, more so than most people. I realise society could become more unequal and more prosperous, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not always the case. Then he trotted out the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy. So there is a cluster of statistics, and he claims this proves that they're interconnected. Well, there's lower inequality in almost every other highly economically developed country. And in many of them, the average wages are higher in the United States, and there's stronger economic growth, and the minimum wage is higher. So the fact that the data is grouped doesn't prove that it's interrelated. So there was an inductive fallacy of his. He instantly assumes that the income gap causes economic growth, inventions and great services, but there's a scant evidential basis for that. Didn't say there's no evidential basis. Then there was the appeal to Stone, another logical fallacy, suggesting that it's ludicrous without proving that it is ludicrous. Okay, he claims that the claim being that inequality causes poverty. He says that's ridiculous, but he doesn't prove that it's ridiculous. You take $1 from a billionaire and give it to a woman who's absolutely nothing, you have reduced poverty, because she's got one more dollar than she had before, and you've also reduced inequality. All right? It's a very simple, small-scale example, but it proves the logic of what I'm saying. So he says that income equality at Walmart does not cause poverty. Now, that could be true, but it's a vacuous truth. It doesn't prove that a minimum wage is bad. To some extent, these things are two ships passing in the night, whether inequality doesn't cause poverty and whether the minimum wage is a good or a bad thing. So he often comes up with these false dichotomies, trying to distinguish between things which are not really different, claiming that inequality is not a problem of poverty. Well, as I just demonstrated, if we took wealth from the richest and gave it to the poorest, it would make them better off. You might say, oh, well, you know, the dollar would just go down in value. We could do this in houses. Somebody's homeless, another person has 1,000 homes. Take one home off the very rich person and give it to the homeless person. The homeless person is therefore better off, housed, and the person with 1,000 houses gone down to 999, and you've reduced inequality and you've reduced poverty at the same time without materially affecting the very wealthy person. So you've got the poo-poo argument. You might say the workers of the world are uniting, okay, suggesting that this argument does not merit a proper discussion and just getting people laughing, dismissing it out of hand. Then there is misleading vividness, another logical fallacy of his, which is also called the appeal to emotion. You know, ultimately this would lead to guys with your guns coming to your house in the middle of the night. So he's producing a shocking and violent image in the minds of his listeners. But it's irrelevant to the minimum wage. When has the minimum wage ever been enforced by SWAT teams smashing down a door at 3 o'clock in the morning and hauling people off to Supermax? Anyway, he's pro-gun. He ought to like guns everywhere. He likes the war on drugs, and he likes the CIA and Homeland Security busting people they think are terrorists. He likes Israeli families breaking into Palestinian family homes. So anyway, Mr. Shapiro, facts don't care about your feelings. When has this ever happened that armed police have broken down doors to enforce the minimum wage? If you do have to arrest people, there are other ways to do it. He believes in being very tough on crime, so I'm surprised he's become so limp-wristed all of a sudden. Anyway, another logical fallacy, proving too much. If guys with guns is a valid rationale for opposing this law, then no laws should exist, because ultimately all laws might have to be enforced by the police, and the police occasionally have to carry out raids on people's homes, and the police carry guns. So I'm doing what he does, is taking his logic and taking it to the fair, just going to a ridiculous level with it. So another logical fallacy of his was a false analogy, a false comparison. He says that, the left wants gay couples to be allowed to wed, and so consent matters there, but consent doesn't matter when workers and employers agree a contract. Well, now when Mr. Shapiro got married, was that because he was employing his wife, or she was employing him? Now, it's true that sometimes one spouse earns the money and the other looks after the home, but this is not an employment relationship. An employer can have millions of workers. Maybe Mr. Shapiro has millions of wives, or his wife has millions of husbands. He's not comparing like with like. Anyway, it's not a matter of loving someone and committing to them for life when you agree to work at Walmart. Anyway, so pay everyone the same and nationalize all businesses. That's what he was suggesting that his opponents should want. This is a straw man argument. Nobody's suggesting that. And it's also reductio ad absurdum. So he can't argue against the substance of what his opponents are saying. So anyway, he talks. Let's look at some states without a minimum wage: South Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee. There are more. So they are among the poorest states in the union. Didn't say they're the very poorest, but it certainly doesn't prove that the minimum wage is going to make you more prosperous. And let's say Georgia has got a minimum wage, but it's below what the federal government recommends. So there we have it. Anyway, I could go on all day. That's just one of his videos, which is really jam-packed with logical fallacies. I'll do some other ones later. Thank you. Which logical fallacies did I use in my video? See if you can spot them and expose them.